Hello and welcome to Fall 2020 History 332, the history of ancient Greece and Rome. I'm CJ Armstrong, your professor for this term. All of our information for office hours, course times, where I can be found, etc. are in the syllabus, which is available on Blackboard. We'll be using Blackboard and Zoom for our synchronous and asynchronous online environment until such time as we can meet face-to-face. I'm looking forward to meeting you, at least by video, and looking forward to those synchronous times. But these asynchronous videos, these are the pieces that you're going to be working with in order to consider the narrative of ancient history that we'll be treating and the focus on the particular subject that we'll cover this term. This course is called Ancient Greece and Rome. And every other year, I focus more attention on one of those pieces than others. This is an even year, Fall 2020, and we'll be doing Greece from the Bronze Age and the Archaic period and into the Classical Age. This is going to be our primary focus. A lighter touch on the Bronze Age, a lighter touch on the Hellenistic period, that period of the 4th century, through to the Roman period of the 1st century BC. And focus more of our attention on the Archaic and the Classical Age, particularly as that's relayed to us in the literary history, but along with the narrative of history in these asynchronous videos that you're going to be accessing yourself. I want to offer you a taste of the material culture, the material evidence as well, so that you get a sense both of the material and the literary evidence that we engage to think about the history of this place that we call Greece. So with that kind of a focus, we will also be limiting our reading to Greek primary sources and orienting ourselves critically and contextually with secondary resources that look at both the history and the literary evidence that we're going to be talking about, with reading assignments that you're going to be having to prepare week by week. For the weeks ahead, we'll be reading the Odyssey of Homer first, all 24 books of that epic. Then we'll be looking at some Athenian drama. We'll look at Sophocles' Oedipus, Tyrannus, Oedipus Rex, and then go back to read 2 out of the 3 plays in the trilogy, the Oresteia trilogy by Aeschylus. And we'll then look at some historians. We have selections from the Moses Finley reader of Herodotus and Thucydides, as we think primarily about the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. And then we'll round out our cultural look at other bits that make up this Greek civilization with the reading of a philosopher. Everybody in this class will read the dialogue that Plato wrote about his teacher Socrates, and it's called the Phaedo. That'll be near the end of our class. So get ready for your evaluation in quizzes and exams, however we're able to distribute those and evaluate benchmarks and performance in the course by thinking about material evidence, the images, the artwork that I'm able to offer you on screen, as well as literary evidence, the stuff that we do here in these kinds of lectures and the stuff that we do in discussion, and the things that you're reading on your own. All of this is going to be fair game as we think about the history of the Greeks. You can do this, and by signing up for this course, taking a history major or just doing this because you need some history credit, you are proclaiming to all of us, including the registrar, but especially me and your peers in this class, that you want to do this, and I know that you can do this. So why do you want to do this? Why study the Greeks? That's the subject ultimately of this first lecture, this introductory time. Why study the Greeks? And so you're going to hear from me an apologia for why we will study the Greeks, the lens through which I intend to view the object of study for this course. The fact is, everyone wants to deal with the Greeks at some point. I get roped into all kinds of conversations to have my knowledge of the classical world, the ancient world, justify one position or the other. You end up seeing the Greeks in the news, especially when it has to do with domestic or foreign policy by our lawmakers, by our president or governor, or whatever it happens to be. People are looking for ancient precedent and antiquity as an authority. But I think that that would be one of several not very good reasons to study the Greeks. Everyone wants to deal with the Greeks at some point, so we've got to ask why we should, but also what are some not very good reasons to study ancient history, to study these ancient forebears and fonts of Western civilization. Here are some bids for the not why we should. That is, here are the not very good reasons to study the Greeks. And I'd invite you to draw connections to other subjects in history as well. For any history course you take, there would be some not very good reasons to study the subject. For the Greeks, our subject in this class, I would begin by saying that some people study the Greeks because they assume that there's relevance to them. You wouldn't want to study anything irrelevant, and therefore you should study this because it has relevance. And then we search around for the relevance that the Greeks might have. How relevant are the Greeks? Well, they're relevant because, some might say, there's an unbroken succession of thought or an unbroken succession of culture from the ancients to the moderns. But that's not necessarily true. People change. You don't step in the same river twice. That's what one famous Greek philosopher said. This is where cultural bids for classical antiquity of an institution or classical antiquity of an argument or ancientness lend some kind of justification. People lean on antiquity to give them authority in an argument. You know, the Greeks said this, therefore it was right for us to look at this culture in a certain way, or invade that country at the time we did, or think about morality or philosophy or education or science in a certain way. It's not a very good reason to study the Greeks, because leaning on antiquity to give you authority is an argument that's only as good as those who would believe, buy into, and assume that those ancients had the right idea. No one has any authority more than what people are willing to give them. And I want you, as students, as scholars, as thinkers, as human beings, I want you to be careful about arguments from antiquity and tradition. Just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it's good, or just because it's older than you doesn't necessarily mean it's better than you. Yes, I want you to respect your elders. Yes, I want you to respect your mother and father and your grandparents. And I want you to respect me and those who are in authority. But realize that when we're talking about the ancient world, they don't just have authority because they happen to be ancient. Even though the assumption of relevance for the Greeks, because of their antiquity and therefore authority, is seemingly a conservative position because of its natural leaning toward preserving the past, understand that that idea of using the ancients as some kind of an authority is a tool that's used both by the right and the left in modern debate. It produces an idea that's called Western exceptionalism, and I have to admit, I think it has a lot going for it, but it ought to make you itchy. That is the idea that there's the West and then there's the rest because the West is the best. That ought rightly to make somebody like you, a liberal thinker, somebody who is free in her mind, somebody who's free in his mind, that ought to make you itchy. So my encouragement to you in this and in all other courses in Western tradition, civilization, in comparative civilization, in world history, is to find out what Western civilization indeed does have going for it and explore and ask why. But don't put all of your eggs into any supremacist basket. You'll end up losing your eggs, and you'll end up with egg on your face. I personally am not a Western exceptionalist. It's an ideology, and all ideologies are lies, but we do have to acknowledge some things make the Greeks stand out. They are things that we are indebted to. like politics and architecture and art and epistemology, the way we think and how we know what we know. We do have a lot of debts to give to the Greeks, but that doesn't mean that we are bound to them as an authority because they are ancient. What are some other not very good reasons to study the Greeks? You're going to hear that some people have assumptions about the study of history that go something like this. We study the past so that we can understand the present. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to say. It's just not why I'm doing this, and I don't want it to be why you're doing this. You're talking your own lens when you do that. We need to understand the past so we can understand the present. You're never going to get away from your own lens, but you might as well objectively look at the baggage that you come with in your own historical time and place and do your best to distinguish what's going on in the past from your own present. You're not studying this stuff so that you can do better in the present or you can understand the present. That's not why to study history. If you are thinking that your own time and place are really the thing that's most important, then go study something else. You shouldn't be studying history. History is the study of stuff that happened in the past. So that's why we're here. We don't study history just so that we can understand the present. We don't study history either, especially this ancient Greek stuff, so that we can see the heroes of history, the history of great men. There's a phrase that should be in your toolbox, the history of great men, which is ideals for shaping our character. Classical education for the last 2,000 years really liked this one. And I'm not saying it's bad. It's certainly a part of history, particularly Western history. But I personally, as a teacher, as a professor, I don't like this one nearly as much as the history of classical education has for the last 2,000 years. They used to call it mirror literature. They give it to elite young males. This is aristocratic education. And he would read these books as if looking into a mirror, and what he'd see looking back at him, staring back at him, or all the greats, all the moral examples of leadership from the past. All right, some people think that that's why we read history. This is why Plutarch certainly is writing the lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, the comparative lives. Some of you may read those for some of your independent work this term. It's an important genre of literature, and it certainly has a relationship to history, this biography of great men. But this is the great man theory of history. It works for moral training, and it works for advancement in leadership. That's what we'd call our moral training these days. This is what leadership talks are all about. If you go to a conference or you have to take like a leadership class or something like that, this is what all those talks are all about. They try to inspire you with everyone who was ever a great leader and find out what kind of traits they had and what sort of elements you can emulate. From Mother Teresa to Jesus to Steve Jobs to Dr. Martin Luther King, right? This is also the regiment of Hitler's youth group. I just want you to realize that. And why presidents write memoirs and we dedicate libraries to them as tourist attractions. So you, as my students, I really want you to have a critical eye on this and simply beware of the vapidness of leadership lingo and all that elitist crap. Unless you like making money and justifying your middle management success in whatever business you end up being an employee of later on. It's the way to rise to the top, just talk the talk and be a leader, that sort of thing. But that all stems from this great man history. And if you're interested, take a look at where that history comes from. We didn't invent this with books with large fonts that talk about the laws of leadership. Okay, we've been doing this forever. So be able to see through the screens of that and realize that sometimes the emperor has no clothes. All right. But I'm talking about history. I'm talking about Greek history and why we ought to study it. And I'm trying to list out some of these reasons, some not very good reasons to study the Greeks. Number one was that we assume some kind of relevance because of an unbroken tradition of culture. We might think that we study this history so that we get some authority from knowing the past, or so that we can understand the present, or so that we can see the heroes of history, the great men. I'm saying that all of these are some not very good reasons to study the history of the Greeks. And since I've knocked down a couple of other theories of history, we might take that old chestnut from George Santayana, who says that we study history lest we make the same mistakes in the present, right? Those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. Well, yeah, that's a nice sentiment, but that's the kissing cousin of the worst of history. Ultimately, the not veriest, goodest reason to study the ancient Greeks is because of that assumption. It's a Whiggish historical assumption that in understanding them, we'll be able to progress the best way we can, so that we can see the notches carved by the boots that are scuffling the road on the inevitable march of progress through the history of the world, right? The Greeks were that highlight, and it just set us running on an inevitable trajectory to where we are now, which is the best and most progressive and most advanced and smartest time in history. Well, I have a lot of hesitancy in agreeing with that idea. You know, I ask students from time to time, do you think we're smarter than those people that lived back then? And I have some students say, yeah, of course we're smarter than all those guys. They're all dead. Okay, they say, yeah, of course we're smarter. We have smartphones. Does that really make us smarter? I think this is so wrong in so many ways. I'm going to put off what I'd like to say about this for a couple of presentations. When we get to the eras like the so-called Dark Age and the Archaic Age and what historians have called the Classical Age, I'm going to bring this up again. But understand that the idea or the assumptions behind Whig history or Whiggish history, that is absolutely not a very good reason to study these ancient Greeks. Notice that what I've been saying is some not very good reasons to study the Greeks, and that's different than saying, here's why we shouldn't study the Greeks. Of course, there have been plenty of arguments advanced for why we shouldn't study the Greeks, and I'll be surprised if you don't try to pull one of these on me later on, and we'll have to come back to this. I'm not talking about all the good reasons not to study at all, like the circumstances this semester. Hey, I don't want to study. I've got that low-grade depression like the rest of the world. We're in still the beginning of our COVID epidemic. I don't want to study online. I want to be able to have a university education or at least a college experience. And now I got to study these. Now, I'm not talking about those kind of vapid reasons. Here's one original proverb to C.J. Armstrong. You can quote me on this. It's always easier to do nothing than it is to do something. I know you can dwell on that, meditate on it. It's always easier to do nothing than it is to do something. I'm not talking about that, though, as a reason not to study anything. Right? I'm talking about the justifications that we use for staying ignorant, based on rationalizations that assume a certain posture of criticism, especially a posture of criticism against those that we might consider not as civilized or not as advanced, or Whiggishly, just our precursors until they could be perfected in us, the Concordia Eagles or something. These are the statements that begin, the Greeks are not worthwhile because... And this is how it usually goes. The Greeks, why would you study the Greeks? They aren't worthwhile. They were a bunch of sexists. They didn't believe in women's suffrage or even that women were as important as men or as fully functional as men. They didn't believe in equal rights like we do. We're so much more advanced. Right? The Greeks were a bunch of sexists. The Greeks were bellicose. They wanted to fight wars against everybody. They loved to sharpen their blades and go up against another hoplite phalanx and dominate. And they were chauvinists, and they were these warlike barbarians compared to us. Here's why we shouldn't study the Greeks. The Greeks aren't worthwhile because, after all, they were a slave culture. They had slaves, and we're so much more enlightened because we don't. I don't like the Greeks. They're mean. All right. I'm not going to argue the veracity of those things. I'm not going to try to justify the Greeks against those charges. I'd agree with all those charges, absolutely. And that's nothing to glory in. That's one good reason not to use them as an antique authority for the present. Does that make sense? They were a bunch of sexists, and they did have slaves, and so did everybody else from 3000 BC till time immemorial. But understand this. The reason I say that that's something we're going to shy away from, and this is what I'll repeat to you if you try to pull these kinds of things on me later on in this semester, is that frankly, my students, we have no right to judge our forebears. I'm going to encourage you in the habit of observing the 8th commandment as historians. For those of you who have a Judeo-Christian background or have been to catechism, you know what the 10 commandments are, right? Honor your father and mother is the 4th commandment. You will have no other gods is the 1st commandment. This is how we number these things. And the 8th commandment goes like this. You will not bear false witness against your neighbor. You're not going to slander your neighbor. You're not going to tell lies about your neighbor. I'm in the habit, and I want you to be in the habit as a historian, of observing the 8th commandment. And remember that your neighbor is not just the person next to you or the person that you're interacting with over a Zoom call. Your neighbor is also somebody who's possibly dead, and somebody who's been dead for a couple of thousand years, according to the subject that we're learning in this class. The people that we're studying, whether they were slaves or women, free citizens, males, medics, foreigners, barbarians, or civilized, these people are real people. And I want you to treat them with the respect that they deserve. And I'm going to attempt to model that. Yeah, there's going to be some baddies and some goodies. Yeah, there's going to be some winners and some losers. But we can be objective enough, at least to start with this. These are human beings. And if human, then they are our neighbors. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just remember what Thumper's mother said to Thumper in the movie Bambi. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Before we start criticizing the Greeks, you got to ask also, on that line of having no right to judge our forebears, frankly, how far have we really come? Really? Are you really that much better than these sexist, slave-owning, warlike Greeks? Believe me, when you get to be 50 years old with teenagers of your own, it's not just your dad jokes and your outdated fashions that the kids will despise you for. It's your outmoded morals and your epistemology, the way you think, the way that your brain fashions the things that you know that you know. They're going to look at you and think that you are the weirdest guy ever or the weirdest mom ever. And that's not too long from now. That's only another 20 or 30 years from now. They'll despise you for it. And that's just 1 or 2 generations. We really don't move that far in our quest for erudition and enlightenment. And if we on balance think that our form of government or our suffrage, our franchise, if we think that our citizenship or relative freedom from human trafficking is more enlightened than the ancients, well, think first how little time has elapsed between those times when those relative freedoms and enlightenments became law and the present day. And think second, how little real progress against prejudice is still made, especially as we have it front and center in our faces, from the news cycle to the anxieties of an election year. Think, number 3, how tenuous is our hold on any so-called enlightenment or progress. This leads us to the next point, which is indeed why to study this stuff. Your civilization is at the edge of a precipice of disaster that inches closer every time you fail to express gratitude when it's appropriate, every time you fail to throw your trash away in a trash can because it's more convenient to litter. Your civilization is at the edge of a precipice of disaster, unless you study history. Here, in the end, are the bids for why we should, indeed, This is all important for me and why I'm in love with this stuff and why I love teaching this history and spreading this evangel of studying ancient crap all the time, whether it's with undergraduates or whether it's with graduate students or whether it's even with my Sunday morning Bible class at the church that I serve. On the face of it, it's worthwhile to study the Greeks because people are always bringing them up, whether that's about social and cultural cachet or authority or supremacy or whatever. The Greeks are used to affirm our standing in the world. And I've said it already, I'm saying it again, you need to beware of this crap. There's no such thing as purity. So beware the rhetoric of those who say this is purely Western civilization or something like that. And you need to learn not to misplace your trust, like what I said a little while ago. It's always used in support of nationalism or defense against insecurities, and you need to learn not to misplace your trust. Stories abound about this, and as a classicist, I'm asked frequently about the ancients with the assumption that they carry some kind of cultural authority. So I have to be careful with my answers. And my students, so do you. Why should we study the Greeks? Because of irrelevance? Yes, but not because of a current relevance. I want you as a historian to realize that your job, your calling as a scholar of history, is to understand that what is relevant is the time and place of the thing that you're studying in its own time and place. History is about appreciating the time in its own context. Studying the past, that is, not for the sake of the now, studying the past for its own sake. Not a means to an end, but rather as an end unto itself, to wax Aristotelian about it. We study this history, yes, because people are always bringing it up, but we should know why. We study this history because it is relevant in its own time and place, so let's fall in love with that. We study this history as a necessary precondition for stuff also that defines this university and me for sure, as well as many of you individually. And what I'm talking about there is the church relatedness, the Christian relatedness of this university, this campus, this school. And you, if you happen to be a Christian, as I am, all right? I can't talk about Christianity as if it's a myth that happened in no time at all in some kind of fairyland, in some kind of fairy tale. We talk about this as historically grounded, as certainly a cultural development from the Romans, who are inheritors and debtors to the Greeks. We can say thank you, Romans, and we can say thank you, Greeks, for the kinds of things that were ultimately salient to the development of Christianity. There's no Christianity without the ancient world. We owe a debt to the Greeks in particular for things like what we take for granted as the bifurcation of the body and the soul. We're going to talk about the immortality of the soul for sure as we deal with it in the Phaedo, as well as dialectic, which is necessary for theology, the study of history, even the epic poetry and the lyric poetry. We don't get the Bible that we get without the Greeks. But that's somewhat incidental. Let's get to the juicy stuff. Why study the Greeks? Because they were good. Let me tell you, they were good at everything they cared to do, at everything that they wanted to think about. The Greeks perfected it. We've got a saltine cracker's worth of real material and literary evidence compared with what has been lost to time. But wow, what's on that soda cracker is immensely interesting, amazing. It's extraordinary. It shows us that they were really, really smart. They gave us evidence of an immense devotion to their city and gave us the groundwork for civic value of the polis. which is not just, see, monarchy or theocracy or a theopolitical mix of public discharge, which defined every other human gathering from the Bronze Age on. The Greeks invented politics. And this invention of political life was the first shift from that old traditional way, the way that we might call tribal or monarchical. The Greeks were extremely self-critical. They had a huge capacity for self-criticism, and with it, the criticism of others. And that's where the academy is born. You're an academic, I'm an academic. If you want to be a professional academic, you got to be like me and my colleagues. And that's the baggage of all academics, that we're not only skeptical and self-critical and cautious and deeply thoughtful, but we'll also call you out on your crap as soon as you make a misstep in your speech or in your writing. That's the heart and soul of being a critical thinker. And we owe that to the Greeks. We're indebted to the Greeks for philosophy, for the way we talk about ethics and aesthetics and epistemology and ontology, the way we talk about science, the way we think. Notice I say we're not dependent on them, but we owe them something. And we owe the Romans, who preserved them for us and handed it down for civilization in the Mediterranean Empire for another half millennium after Greece was done, and really done. From the Greeks to the Romans, to the Middle Ages, to the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment, to you and me. In these large cultural waves, we never get rid of the debt that we owe to the Greeks. We're not dependent on them, but we do owe them some gratitude. Their artwork, I said they're great at everything they put their mind to, everything they put their hand to. Artwork is a proof of that, even from the little that still survives. Our statuary and the marbles, the bronzes, the terracotta, the pots, right? Some of the painting that we see, we only have a little bit of fresco, but we got plenty of pots. They were perfectionists with literature. This is why we have you read Homer's Iliad in the core, and why you're reading another Homeric epic this term with us. In epic, in drama, in lyric, in historiography, they were perfectionists. In philosophy and in science, they're perfectionists. And that came from their attitude of competition. Athletics, it's a Greek word itself, competition. With competition, not only the capacity, but also the need for failure. As competitive as they were to be the very best, they also soberly meditated on the reality of failure, understanding the limitations of the human condition. Strife for excellence risks failure, and that gets us to the humanness of it all. Notice something as we begin this study, my students. You've been told all your life two things. I know, because I know you're between the ages of 18 and 24, at least 90% of you, right? And in this late adolescent period of your life, your young adulthood, you've been told all your life two things. If you've grown up in Western civilization, if you've been in America or in another Western-styled nation, we don't get away from this in American culture broadly. Here are the two things you've been told. Number one, be all you can be. And number two is the polar opposite of that. Don't get too big for your britches. Notice number one and number two are opposites. Be all that you can be. You got to strive for excellence. Get that A, get that scholarship. And B is, hey, don't forget, you're not all that you're cracked up to be, right? Stay humble. Nobody likes a snob. You ever wonder why you might be risking mental illness? It might be because you've been told two contradictory statements your entire life, and this is what shapes your entire existence. And the reason, unconsciously even, that people have been telling you this stuff is because they inherited it from their forebears. These two statements are totally at odds with each other. That might be why you're going crazy in your dorm room or with your significant other, or why you feel pressured to get A's and you feel depressed when things aren't easy enough to succeed. And all this stuff ultimately has its root in that inherited value system that we owe in no small part to a chauvinism as well as a limitation in these people that we're studying. They have a high anthropology. They believe that man is the measure of all things. But they also acknowledge limitations. Know thyself. And they practice moderation. Know your limitations. Nothing in excess. Like Dirty Harry says, a man's got to know his limitations. That's why this is and should be a humanizing experience. My dear students, that's the final point for this opening lecture. Why study the Greeks? Why are we going to spend 16 weeks doing this together? Ultimately, because it's a humanizing experience. That's my major point here. That's why I do humanities. I think studying this stuff makes you a better human being. Just studying ancient history makes you a better human being. Better at being a human being. You've heard me say it in core when we're dealing with Aristotelian teleology and talking about virtues and the well-ordered soul and eudaimonia and all that. There is a way to be human and there is a way not to be. But for all the dehumanizing we've been dealing with in the last go-round of pandemic and civil strife, wouldn't a little bit of humanity be a welcome respite from the cold and angry black box machine I have to lecture into and you have to watch and interact with, instead of doing things that are real? I have a colleague who wanted a Latin motto for her new position this year, so I suggested a real one. Non virtuale sed reale. Not something virtual, but something real. Something that gets to the human side of us. Incidentally, a footnote on that. Never ask for a Latin motto from me, by the way. I know you're just getting a tattoo, and I'll lie to you so that you can get something misspelled. That'll be with you for the rest of your life. I think that's a funny joke because I have a sick sense of humor, just like Jesus does. But I digress. It's not just online education that dehumanizes. It's brutality. It's unneighborliness. It's screaming across the partisan aisles in judgment on your virtual neighbor, whether on social media or in class, at the Thanksgiving table or in church. It's uncritical assessment of your role in the world and the institutions that you belong to. What I'm saying is that nothing humanizes us like the humanities does. So we're going to proceed on this line to celebrate the humanness of these humans, these long dead but still living voices. You don't need to listen to them. Go be an ignorant salesperson or citizen or engineer or insurance company manager who knows how irrelevant the humanities are to making money and surviving if this stuff seems too hard or boring or whatever. You can be a wise and honorable and cultivated whatever you want. And certainly, we can graduate you without this class. And ancient history does not need you to study it. And you'll hear through every generation how ancient studies and classics and dead language learning like Latin and Greek and all the stuff we classicists do, you'll be hearing throughout the rest of your life how classics is dying. But you know what? It never dies. These voices will continue to speak even if you choose not to listen to them. People will continue to talk about the Greeks. And we need people like you who are willing to learn to preserve their realness, their humanity, from being co-opted into the next bid for presidency or slick ad campaign. So let's get on to the humanity of the humanities, and you'll realize something else, a happy surprise. It'll make you more human too. I'll see you soon.